Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the rules of the global game have changed overnight. The currency that has dominated trade for decades is losing its grip. The energy markets, once dictated by a handful of players, are now controlled by a new and unexpected alliance. Nations once considered secondary are stepping onto the world stage, not to take part in someone else's story, but to write their own. This is not science fiction. This is happening right now. In boardrooms from New York to Berlin, in political circles from Washington to Brussels, there's a quiet but unmistakable sense of unease. Because BRICS, the once modest coalition of emerging economies, has just pulled off a move that could redefine the global order for decades to come. The expansion, the alliances, the new financial systems, they're not just headlines, they're signals of a world in transition where old powers are being challenged and new ones are rising with confidence. Today we'll explore why America is worried, how BRICS has changed the rules, and what this means for Europe's future. We're talking about energy dominance, the end of dollar supremacy, and the birth of a multipolar world. If you want to understand not just where the world is heading, but how it will affect your life, your economy, and your future, stay with me, because by the end of this speech, you'll see the global chessboard in a way you've never seen before. This is more than news. This is history unfolding in real time. The recent expansion of BRICS has completely altered the global balance of power, sending ripples across financial, political, and strategic circles worldwide. What was once a five-nation grouping, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has now opened its doors to new members that hold significant influence in energy, trade, and geopolitics. This is not just a symbolic move, it is a calculated step that amplifies the group's economic and political weight. By adding countries that control vital resources like oil, natural gas, and rare minerals, BRICS is building a network that challenges the dominance of long-standing Western-led institutions. From a purely statistical standpoint, the expansion boosts the alliance's share of global GDP, population, and natural resources to levels that surpass even the G7 in certain areas. For example, the inclusion of major oil exporters means that BRICS now has a decisive say in global energy markets. This not only strengthens their negotiating power, but also allows them to set terms that could influence global pricing structures. For countries in Europe and North America, this shift represents a challenge to the systems they have relied on for decades. Geopolitically, the expansion sends a clear message. Emerging economies are no longer content to be secondary players in a world dominated by the United States and its allies. They are creating their own platforms to discuss trade, security, and development without having to follow the rules set in Washington or Brussels. This is a declaration of independence from a system perceived by many as unequal and exploitative. For Europe, this development is particularly significant. The continent is heavily interlinked with global trade networks and energy imports, and any reconfiguration of these systems can have immediate consequences. An expanded BRICS with stronger economic leverage could push Europe into situations where it must rethink its alliances or adapt to a more diverse, multi-centered world order. What makes this moment historic is that it is not just about economics, but about influence and identity on the world stage. Countries that were once divided by geography, politics, or ideology are now finding common ground in their desire to shape the rules of the future. This shift marks the early stages of a transformation in how power is distributed globally, and is one that even the most established powers can no longer ignore. The move towards de-dollarization is perhaps the most unsettling development for Washington in the context of BRICS' growing influence. For decades, the US dollar has not only been the dominant global currency, but also the backbone of America's economic power. It has allowed the United States to settle international trade, control global financial flows, and exert influence far beyond its borders. This dominance gave America what economists call an exorbitant privilege, enabling it to borrow cheaply, run large deficits, and impose sanctions with devastating effects. But the tide is turning, and the BRICS nations are at the forefront of this shift. In recent years, several BRICS members have actively promoted the use of their own currencies for bilateral trade. China and Russia, for instance, have increased settlements in yuan and rubles. India has begun paying for oil imports from Russia in rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely. Even more telling is the growing acceptance of these currencies by countries outside BRICS, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, which are eager to escape the volatility and political strings attached to the dollar-based system. The reasons are both economic and strategic. For many nations, reliance on the dollar exposes them to exchange rate risks, U.S. monetary policy fluctuations, and most importantly, Washington's geopolitical leverage. The U.S. has repeatedly used the dollar's central role as a weapon, imposing sanctions that freeze assets and cut off access to the global banking system via mechanisms like SWIFT. BRICS countries see developing alternative currency arrangements as a way to protect themselves from such vulnerabilities. There is also the symbolic aspect. Trading in local currencies represents more than just financial independence. It's a statement of sovereignty. It signals to the world that economic cooperation doesn't have to be mediated by the United States. This resonates strongly with countries that feel the current global order serves Western interests at their expense. For Europe, the implications are complex. On one hand, the euro already serves as a secondary global currency, and European economies could benefit from a more diversified financial landscape. On the other hand, a rapid decline in dollar dominance could destabilize markets, shift investment patterns, and weaken the transatlantic financial system that Europe is deeply integrated into. The momentum behind de-dollarization, fueled by BRICS' economic clout and political will, is no longer a fringe idea. It is an emerging reality that could redefine global finance in the coming decade. The inclusion of some of the world's largest oil and gas producers into the BRICS alliance has dramatically shifted the global energy landscape. For decades, control over energy supply, particularly oil and natural gas, has been a cornerstone of geopolitical power, with the West, especially the United States, enjoying significant influence through relationships with key producers. Now, with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others aligning with BRICS, the traditional balance of this influence is tilting. These nations are not just resource suppliers, they are critical decision makers in organizations like OPEC, which directly impacts global pricing and availability. By bringing such energy giants into the fold, BRICS has effectively consolidated a massive share of the world's energy reserves under a cooperative framework that is not beholden to Western priorities. This means that policy decisions regarding production levels, pricing strategies, and export terms can increasingly be shaped in a way that aligns with the economic and political goals of BRICS rather than those of Washington or Brussels. For countries dependent on energy imports, this shift introduces new uncertainties and potentially higher bargaining costs. For Europe, this is particularly significant because of its recent struggles with energy security. The disruption of Russian gas supplies exposed vulnerabilities in its energy strategy, forcing many nations to seek alternative sources at higher prices. If more energy exporters start prioritizing trade within BRICS or accepting payments in non-dollar currencies, Europe may find itself competing on less favorable terms or facing pressure to adjust its trade and diplomatic policies to maintain access. This realignment also strengthens BRICS' ability to influence the energy transition debate. As the world moves towards renewable energy, fossil fuel producers still hold immense leverage in the short to medium term, and their decisions on investments, infrastructure, and supply can shape the pace of change. BRICS could use this leverage to negotiate better terms for its members in areas like technology transfer, infrastructure financing, and green energy partnerships. What makes the shift even more profound is the political dimension. Energy has always been more than just a commodity. It's a tool of influence. With BRICS controlling such a large portion of the supply, it can decide to reward allies with favorable deals or impose tougher conditions on those who oppose its agenda. This level of control over such a vital resource fundamentally changes the dynamics of global power and puts the West, particularly the United States and Europe, in a position where they must rethink how they secure their energy future. One of the most transformative moves BRICS is making is the development of an alternative financial infrastructure designed to bypass Western control systems like SWIFT, the IMF, and the World Bank. For decades, these institutions have been the backbone of global finance, with rules, regulations, and leadership structures heavily influenced, if not outright controlled, by the United States and its allies. Membership in these systems often comes with political and economic strings attached, allowing the West to shape the policies and decisions of countries seeking loans, aid, or access to global banking networks. BRICS aims to change that by building parallel systems that give its members and partners greater independence. The new development bank, NDB, established by BRICS, is a direct example of this ambition. Unlike the IMF, which often imposes strict austerity measures on borrowing countries, the NDB offers loans without the same political conditions. This is appealing to nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia that have grown weary of the IMF's influence over domestic policy. Beyond the NDB, BRICS nations are working on cross-border payment systems that eliminate the need for SWIFT, the global messaging service dominated by Western institutions. This not only reduces reliance on the dollar, but also shields members from being excluded from global trade through sanctions. The significance of this cannot be overstated. The United States has repeatedly used financial exclusion as a weapon, cutting countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela off from SWIFT to cripple their economies. By creating a payment network independent of Western control, BRICS is effectively building a safety net for nations that want to protect themselves from such measures. So this alternative infrastructure could even attract non-BRIC members who share the same concerns about overdependence on Western financial systems. For Europe, this development is a double-edged sword. On one hand, more financial networks could mean greater diversity and resilience in global trade. On the other, it weakens the tools that the West, including the EU, has relied on to enforce international norms through sanctions. If major economies can sidestep Western control systems, the effectiveness of such economic pressure will diminish drastically. What's emerging is not just an economic alternative, but an ideological one. An assertion that the global financial system should not be controlled by a small group of powerful nations. BRICS' progress in building this infrastructure signals the beginning of a multipolar financial order where no single bloc can unilaterally dictate the rules of global commerce. For most of the modern era, the idea of global leadership has been closely tied to alignment with the West, particularly the United States and its allies in Europe. Nations seeking economic growth, political security, or international legitimacy often felt they had to operate within Western-defined rules and institutions. This arrangement created a world order that was largely unipolar, with Washington at the center, setting the tone for global trade, finance, diplomacy, and even cultural influence. But the rise of BRICS and its evolving role is rapidly reshaping that reality into something far more multipolar. The growth of BRICS is not just about adding new members or increasing GDP statistics. It's about redefining the pathways to influence on the global stage. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America now see a viable alternative platform where they can negotiate, cooperate, and form alliances without feeling subordinate to the West. This shift in perception is crucial because it changes the very psychology of international relations. When nations believe they have more than one seat at the table, they are more likely to push for reforms, resist pressure, and pursue policies that prioritize their own interests over external expectations. This multipolar evolution also affects the balance of power in subtle but significant ways. If developing countries no longer depend solely on Western financial institutions or trade partnerships, they can make bolder choices in domestic policy and foreign affairs. For example, a nation that might once have feared US sanctions could now turn to BRICS members for economic lifelines, investment, or energy supplies. Similarly, nations seeking infrastructure funding no longer have to accept IMF or World Bank terms if they can secure loans from the new development bank or bilateral agreements within BRICS. For Europe, this emerging multipolarity presents both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, it dilutes the West's ability to enforce its policies globally, reducing the effectiveness of collective diplomatic and economic pressure. On the other, it could create new avenues for cooperation if European nations are willing to engage with BRICS on equal terms. The danger lies in assuming that the old order will continue unchanged. What is unfolding is a rebalancing of global influence, where leadership is no longer the monopoly of one bloc. Instead of a single captain steering the global ship, there are now multiple navigators with their own routes and destinations, each shaping the world according to their own vision of progress and sovereignty. Europe now finds itself in a uniquely complex position as the global balance of power shifts with the rise of an expanded and more assertive BRICS. For decades, European nations have closely aligned themselves with the United States, sharing not only economic interests but also strategic, military, and diplomatic priorities. This transatlantic partnership has been the cornerstone of Europe's global posture, giving it security guarantees through NATO, access to the US-led financial system, and a strong voice in international policy making. However, the growing influence of BRICS introduces a new set of calculations that Europe can no longer ignore. The expanding bloc offers both opportunities and risks for Europe. On one side, BRICS represents vast markets, abundant resources, and investment potential that could benefit European economies struggling with slow growth, high energy cost, and post-pandemic recovery challenges. Access to cheaper energy from BRICS members, partnerships in infrastructure, and trade diversification could strengthen Europe's economic resilience. Yet on the other side, deeper engagement with BRICS could create friction with the United States, which views the bloc's rise as a challenge to its global dominance. This tension places Europe in a narrowing space where neutrality becomes increasingly difficult. Choosing to fully align with the US-led policies might mean missing out on strategic economic partnerships with BRICS nations. Conversely, moving closer to BRICS could risk diplomatic strain with Washington and undermine the unity of Western alliances, especially in areas like sanctions policy or security cooperation. The war in Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, and energy disputes have already highlighted the difficulty of balancing these competing interests. The situation is further complicated by the diversity of opinions within Europe itself. Some nations, driven by economic pragmatism, may favor stronger ties with BRICS members, while others prioritize the preservation of transatlantic solidarity. This internal divide could weaken Europe's ability to present a unified foreign policy at a time when global power structures are becoming more fragmented. For Europe, the challenge lies in finding a strategy that preserves its security commitments while expanding its economic partnerships. This requires diplomatic agility, strategic investment in emerging markets, and an honest reassessment of whether the old model of unquestioned alignment with the United States still serves Europe's long-term interest. In a world where BRICS is shaping new trade routes, financial systems, and political alliances, Europe's decisions in the coming years will determine whether it remains a central player in the new global order or is forced to adapt to terms set by others. What we are witnessing is not a minor adjustment in global politics, but a historic transformation of the world order. BRICS, once viewed as a loose economic partnership, has evolved into a formidable force capable of reshaping trade, finance, energy, and diplomacy. Its expansion signals the rise of a multipolar world where influence is distributed across multiple power centers, not concentrated in a single bloc. For America, this is a direct challenge to decades of dominance. For Europe, it is a strategic crossroads, one that demands careful navigation, adaptability, and vision. The decisions made today will determine whether Europe remains a shaper of the new order or simply a responder to it. The old rules are fading, the new game has begun, and the stakes could not be higher. Thank you for being part of this important conversation, for opening your minds to new perspectives, and for engaging in the dialogue that will shape our shared future. I wish you the wisdom to see beyond the headlines, the courage to embrace change, and the determination to seize the opportunities that this new era presents. Good luck and thank you.